So namaste and welcome to Satsang today. So Satsang is for the direct experience of truth, and sometimes to facilitate that direct experience, it's helpful to rewind a little bit. And every now and again, I kind of end up telling this story of the evolution of consciousness, and sometimes it just helps to help us come to see where we're at. So it's a story of consciousness, but it's really the story that all of us follow in our satsang. And you might recognize your own journey in this story. It's a factual story, but it's worthwhile hearing it every now and again. If you've heard it before, just to kind of, I just ask you to openly listen and allow it to permeate you. You begin to recognize that each of us go through very similar stages in our satsang. And that as we listen to this kind of story, we can begin to see the limitations that are holding us back and begin to move beyond them faster. So in the beginning, there was only the formless, I'm going to call it consciousness tonight. I'm going to, just because I don't want to get stuck on any particular word. I don't want to use any particular word. And there was nothing yet. There was just this formless consciousness that we are, that we all are, just this one consciousness that's everywhere. Of course, at that point, there weren't any things, any objects. So the word everywhere really didn't mean anything, because there wasn't anywhere to, consciousness didn't have anywhere to reference itself from. It was just one and whole and complete. And then for no reason at all, this consciousness began to play with making shapes inside itself. It began to become the elements, and it began to take simple shapes, begin to appear as forms. It didn't change or lose anything in that, but it began to appear to try to experience itself. It wanted to experience itself, and it could only do that by taking a particular shape. So it began to experience what it's like to be these shapes. It never lost its original nature, but it began to experience what it was like to be a plant or an amoeba or a fish or any of these shapes, whether it wanted to be a planet or just empty space, whatever it wanted to be. It would take that shape and it would have that experience of being that thing. So when consciousness takes the shape of a cat, it's completely a cat. When it takes the shape of a tree, it's completely a tree. But it's never actually lost its no-thingness, its formless, shapeless no-thingness. It's just kind of pulled itself together into a shape in order to experience what it's like to be a tree. And over time, this urge to know itself through these forms, this urge to experience itself through the forms, led it to kind of evolve into ever more complex species and life forms, and eventually it began to develop into a human being, began to take the shape of a human being. And over our evolution of this particular species, this form, it finally came consciousness, still in its formless nature, appearing to be a human being, looking like, feeling like, speaking like a human being. It began to be able to think about itself. began to, for the first time in all the shapes that it had taken, it was able to self-reflect, it was able to think, and perhaps most importantly, it was able to ask, what am I actually? What really am I? Where did I come from? What is all of this? But in the taking of these shapes, in making these shapes in the shapelessness that it is, consciousness began to get fascinated with those shapes, with those changing, evolving forms that were coming and going. And it began to really believe it is that form. So it began as a human being to really believe, when it first asked, what am I? Actually, the first thing it saw was a human body. So it concluded, well, this is what I am. I am this body. And because it began to believe that it is this human body, consciousness somehow forgot temporarily its formless nature. It forgot its everywhereness. It began to experience itself as a something, and as a human being, as someone. It began to really feel that it was this body only, and that it began with the body, and that it will end with the body. And consciousness began to pay more attention to the thingness, to the coming and goingness, to the changing, to the evolving, to the body that's growing older and maturing and going through experiences. And it forgot its original nature, which is still completely there, but forgotten. It began to experience itself only two ways, either existing as a thing, an object, or not existing, present as a someone, or absent. It began to experience itself as alive in a human body or dead, present or absent. And all this time, it had completely forgotten that there was this third option for existence, that existing as this nothingness that is its original purity, because all of the attention was on the thoughts and the emotions and the thingness and the coming and goingness of the human being. So it went through many millennia and lots of incarnations believing it was the body each time, and believing it disappeared, that the body disappeared, having no experience at all until the next body came, and on it went. And it really experienced this idea that it is a separate being. It really began to truly believe, it forgot its original everywhereness, and really began to believe and experience it was someone, somewhere in one corner of time and space. And it began to believe that everything else that existed was different to it. As consciousness began to focus on the forms and the moving and the changing, began to judge based on what things appear to be, how they look, and not their original nature. And so consciousness as a human being concluded that this was the only place it existed, and began to call everything else separate to it, outside of it, different. And so suddenly all these other beings were also here. Suddenly, instead of this one original purity, there was this whole manifestation of diverse forms, all of which were really itself, its own self. But it had forgotten this in its fascination with the form, with its fixation with the changing and the coming and goingness of manifestation. And so for a long time, it was trapped in this idea that it was this separate being, that everything else outside of this one body mind was different to it. It began to feel really unsafe, began to realize that when the body goes, it was going to go. So it began to try to accumulate everything it could to gather to it, everything it could to feel safe, to feel happy, to feel loved. And that was outer worldly things and inner worldly things, such as respect and love and security. And if we fast forward a very long period of time to where consciousness is finally beginning to feel tired of this idea that it's a separate being, that it's beginning to feel very painful to experience itself as a separate, finite, limited being. And it begins to finally, for the first time, ask some intelligent questions. Is there any more to this than what I've experienced? What is the point of all this if I'm just going to disappear? What am I really? Is this all I am? And just about at that point when it starts to ask those kind of questions as a human being, it will tend to draw to it some being that it thinks is outside of itself, to remind itself of the original knowing that actually it's not really a separate being, that it is everywhere and it's formless and it's experiencing itself as this diversity, but none of these forms are actually separate to each other. None of these forms and species are actually outside of itself. And it begins to draw to it the information needed to begin to come out of this idea that it's separate and isolated and alone. And even once consciousness begins to realize that it's not what it thinks it is, that it's not just this mind and body, it goes about searching how to find its real nature using only the mind and body. It begins to try to think about how to get out of it, how to recognize what's real. It begins to look for certain experiences. And even when it's aware that there is a third option for existence, that it's not just I'm present as a someone or an absent, that there is also this original wholeness that is still here, has always been here, but overlooked. It can take some time for it to begin to realize that it's not going to be able to perceive that wholeness using only the mind and body, that it has to begin to look in some other way. And even as it's waking up out of this dream that it is a separate being, it's still believing in its limitations as a separate being. It's still believing that it might not be able to wake up. It's still experiencing its thoughts about itself in the human form, that it might not be possible to wake up, that it might not happen, that I might not be good enough. It's experiencing all of these thoughts about itself until finally it begins to discern, consciousness begins to realize that none of the things that have happened in my someone-ness can hold me back from realizing what's real about myself. If my real nature is something different to this someone-ness, then can anything that happens in this someone-ness, good, bad, or ugly, affect my ability to recognize my original nature? And then it begins to take quantum leaps, then it begins to really recognize itself. And it comes back to recognize its everywhereness that has been forgotten for such a long time in earthly years, completely, but not totally forgotten. It's just been reminded from a seemingly external source. And at first, when it recognizes its everywhereness again, it begins to reject the form, its humanity. It begins to push against that. It begins to prefer just to be in the fullness of its natural state, this no shapeness, this no thingness. And then the final evolution of this journey, this story of consciousness, is when it comes almost full circle right back to recognizing its original everywhereness and embracing also its someone-ness somewhere. And eventually not even seeing a difference between those two, that it is this all-knowing, all-powerful, omniscient being that is everywhere all the time, also appearing as this human being, this diverse, individual, unique expression, and all that that entails, embracing that as well. So it really helps to kind of look at why this process takes such a long time for some of us. And really it is that we are carrying our limitations as a separate being. When that consciousness deeply feels separate, it takes on a sense of limitation, a sense of finiteness. It experiences lack, not enough, not enough outer resources, not enough time, not enough money, not enough health sometimes, not enough energy, not enough patience. And it takes those limitations into its awakening as we try to recognize what's real about ourselves. We take those limitations with us into our awakening. Our sense of unworthiness, our sense that of doubt that we can achieve this awakening. Everything that we've picked up that's familiar to ourselves over the eons that we've believed that we're separate beings, we take into our awakening. But if our awakening is to recognize our unlimited, infinite nature that's always been here, then as soon as this consciousness can begin to leave behind its self-imposed limitations that it's learned about itself over the years, an awakening really begins to progress. Eventually, it begins to realize I've been having this very, very vivid dream about myself. I'm everywhere and I've always been everywhere. And for such a long time in earthly years, I dreamt that I was someone somewhere, but never once did I lose this original self. I just wasn't looking for it because I was transfixed on the thoughts and the emotions and everything that makes me feel separate. So are you taking your limitations as a separate being into your self-inquiry? Are you allowing those to dictate your exploration of your infinite nature? Can anything that you've picked up along the way in this dream of being a separate being really be true for what you actually are? Can you not be worthy of awakening if you're just coming to see what you've always been and just overlooked for a long time? Can there be any room for doubt that it's going to happen for you if this dream of being a someone was just that, a very vivid, three-dimensional, ongoing dream, but a dream nonetheless? Can there be anything outside of you or anyone outside of you that can stop you awakening? If you are really everywhere all the time already, has there really ever been anyone outside of you? Or was that part of this collective agreement that we have as human beings that we're all separate and we keep reaffirming to each other over and over again? So I really urge you just to look for and at the reasons you're telling yourself why it's not going to happen for you. And really see if that can really be true as your infinite nature unfolds inside itself. What can stop that infinite self, that omnipresent one that you are? What can stop you from recognizing yourself clearly when you want to? If you really were this separate being and you had to change into this every awareness that is your original nature, then something could get in the way of that, couldn't it? Your self-doubts, limitations, unworthiness could actually get in the way of that. But if instead it's more like just looking in the mirror and recognizing, seeing clearly, then what can halt that? What is going to delay that? Over and over again, I'm saying this because over and over again, I find that, and it was the same for me, our innate sense of not being good enough gets projected onto our awakening. That I might not be good enough. My life kept showing me as a separate being that I'm not good enough, and I'm really certain that I might not be good enough to wake up out of the dream. But there is nothing that can stop consciousness waking up out of that dream unless it believes there is something. The only thing that can stop it is its own imagination about itself. The remnants of this dream of being someone that might not make it, someone that doesn't have enough courage or conviction or devotion or whatever we're telling ourselves that really isn't true. You are already what you're looking for. You're just coming to see that clearly. There's no process here. There's just a deepening seeing. And as that seeing deepens, it helps us let go of all those things we thought were true about our someone-ness. And then it becomes clear that this is what I have always been. And then you can enjoy the rest of the time you have with the body, with the mind, but from a clear place of recognition, from a clear place of not being able to get confused anymore. So isn't it time that you leave those limitations behind? Isn't it time that you stop believing that there's something can get in the way of this process? There is nothing more natural to the consciousness that you are than coming back to recognize itself. It's actually extraordinarily hard for the infinite being to somehow pull off this illusion that it's a separate being for so long, so long. It takes so much energy and so much denying our infinite nature that when it really decides it's done with that, when it really gets this urge, I can't live like this anymore, I have to break out of it, there is nothing at all in this universe that can stop it. Only its own imagination. And that should be an exciting thing to realize there can't be anything that stops you. You're simply returning to what you've always been, seeing clearly what you've always been. And that doesn't need to take a long time. And it doesn't need to be extraordinarily painful. I experienced that idea for a very long time. So, you might just want to ditch that idea. And it doesn't need to be a huge sacrifice either. So I'm always trying to shortcut the process and to perhaps this evening particularly show that those limitations that we bring to our awakening are all to do with this dream of being someone, and that they simply don't apply to your awakening. Everything you need that you are going to need to wake up fully, you already have inside you already. There is nothing external needed at all. Just to simply let go of these limitations and it'll happen by itself. The fact that you're hearing these words means it's already deeply, deeply in progress. It's perhaps already too late for it not to happen. It's just a question of how much we're going to slow down that unfolding with our resistance, with these beliefs, these limitations. And we simply don't have to do that. Just because we've believed in our own innate unworthiness our entire existence doesn't mean we have to carry that idea for another minute longer. Of course, we're all going to feel unworthy and not good enough if we spent our entire life trying to get things from other beings that aren't really other, they are ourselves. And that all those beings were also trying to get something from us that they felt they needed from us, like respect or love or approval or recognition or security. Isn't it time to just let that go and deeply inquire with an open heart and an open mind, what am I actually, really? Okay. So I will open up for questions. I have 2 questions here to read out. Well, there's 3, but I'll read 2 tonight. I'll read the other one on Monday in Satsang. So I'll take up to another 4 questions tonight here. So if, just in case you don't know how to raise your hand on Zoom, if you find the participants section and scroll down to the bottom, there's an option there to raise your hand. If you click on that, it will. So we've got 1 question, we'll take up to 3 more. I'll start with these questions that have been emailed in. So the first one says, Dear Helen, thank you so much for your unique teaching and enabling me to see that awakening is possible for a regular person like me. Well, if I can do it, anyone can. So I'm working on dissolving the ego, and I'm having a little difficulty choosing the descriptive word of the noumenon that works best for me to meditate on. Awareness and consciousness are easier than silence or knowing, but I was wondering if love or acceptance could be another option, as I would find that aspect more appealing to focus on. Many thanks. So we called it consciousness tonight, but it really doesn't matter what you call it. I would just ask you to be careful when you're choosing. I'm assuming you're talking about the book and choosing one of the meditative practices from the book, where I've called it all these different names, so it's really the same thing innately. Sometimes from the list of however many there are there, and we feel that we can't choose one, or we have resistance to some of them, it's really mind's way of avoiding starting the practice, because really they all are the same, and they're words like awareness, consciousness, presence, silence, stillness, contextual field, whatever we're calling it, noumenon. It's all synonyms for this I-ness, this immortal, infinite being that we're coming to recognize. So if you want to call it love or acceptance, that's fine. But I would just make sure that you're actually focusing on, that it's not a subtle trick that your mind is using to focus on some feeling of the noumenon, some effect of the noumenon, and to make sure that you're focusing on that which is invisible and intangible by whichever doorway you found in. Just to double check whether that's occurring, whether it's resistance or not, you can ask this question: why don't I like these words, awareness and consciousness? I'm not saying you have to accept those words, but just to, what is it that I'm resisting about them? And you'll begin to uncover these egoic motives that aren't usually the resistance that's going on in the background. So you can call it anything you like at all. You can just call it I, you know, it's really, or I am, whatever you want to choose. But just to make sure you're focusing on the formless aspect. As you read through the practices in the book, if you notice, they're all trying to get you to recognize that which is in the background. Right now, my body is sitting inside the contextual field, the space of my being, which we could call contextual field, you could call it awareness, whatever. But it's always been in the background for most people and never noticed. So just be careful that you aren't focusing on a phenomena by renaming it. Phenomena is something that's coming and going as a start and a finish, and is perceivable, either an inner phenomena like fear, or an outer thing like a physical object. So, okay. It's very common to experience resistance to this kind of practice because it's very direct. It's going to cut through the illusion very quickly. Okay, so this one says, "Hi Helen, before I found you, I used to solve my problems by thinking about them enough to conjure up the feeling they elicited, and then I would give it to God. It really did seem like miracles would happen when I did this. I've noticed when I use the question you have suggested, where am I?" So this is one of the self-inquiry questions that really helped me, this question, where am I? I've noticed that when I use the question you've suggested, where am I, that it creates the same opening in me that my former method did. It takes me out of duality, where I can be relieved that none of my problems really exist, or if they do, they're not as important as this other place in the background where I'm not a mom, a sister, or a wife. I grew up having a devotional personality, but after getting glimpses into non-duality, I stopped praying because I couldn't believe in God anymore. So that meant I lost my tool until I found you and you offered me a new one. You also taught me to embrace duality, so I'm now reconciling my belief in God again. Well, God's just another word for the noumenon, isn't it? Awareness, consciousness, God, self, I, that's all the same. Is giving it to God and asking, where am I, the same thing? Thank you so much, and I love you. I love you too. P.S. I reconciled with my mom and sister after 3 years. Fruits. So, fruits of contemplation. Well done there. So, is giving it to God. So, there's been a traditional devotional practice of giving this challenge or this problem or this karmic pattern to God, to the undivided consciousness, the one self, and stepping out of it personally as a separate being and surrendering it to that. It's very similar when you ask the question, where am I? As you continue to ask that question, you're going to begin to experience that undivided consciousness, which doesn't have a location because it's not a thing. It doesn't have a location. You don't have a location. Your body does. I can say my body's sitting here in this chair. But where I am, I can't really pinpoint. I can't say I'm over here or I'm over there or I'm this big, or this tall, because I'm not a thing. So there's a subtle difference, have the same effect, but to ask the question, where am I, is going to take it to a place where these problems don't exist, as you said so well in your question. But when we're giving it to God, sometimes, and that's why one of the reasons I stepped away from a devotional path for a while, just for a while, I sustained a sense of separate self by being a surrenderer, giving it to God. And as you've seen in this non-dual path, that God that we're giving it to is our self anyway. It's all the same one being, isn't it? It's not that I'm giving it to something outside of me. And this is why I began to embrace duality again, as you said, and began to pray again, whichever way, even though there isn't any entity outside of me to pray to. It is all the one self. We can begin to enjoy that again. So I would say, for me, the question, where am I, had the same effect, but it was undoing this sense of separateness. It was allowing the egoic sense of self to dissolve. Whereas in my own path, the path of surrender for me just was a very long, drawn out experience where I became very good at surrendering things and giving them to God. And as soon as I did that, there's a whole load more to give. And there was this endless supply of things to surrender, faster than I could give them away. In fact, there was more problems coming underneath. So they take you to the same place, but I think one is more permanent than the other, because the self-inquiry question is going to be undoing the sense that you're separate to that God that you're giving it to. And you begin to live as that undivided God self more, in which there isn't any problem, or actually ever was, as you said here. And it's really whichever suits you best. You know, some people prefer that devotional path of surrender. For me, it just became an endless road that would, literally went on forever. Lovely. Okay. So we'll go to Sophie whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Helen.
Hiya.
Hi. So I'm going to share something, a personal thing that I've just come about today, and how that is affecting my awakening. How it is a mirror of that. I could really do. Sorry, I'm now talking. I can't talk. I'm going to stutter a bit, I think. But
okay.
I could.
Okay.
Yeah, it's quite intense. So, but I could really do with just some clear support seeing, because I know the truth. It's just so. The experience is that I just was told today that my brother's wife died in the Philippines, and she was 48. My brother's a couple of years younger than me, and they've got a very disabled son. And prior to her dying, she asked me to do something for her to help her financially within the family context. And I didn't do it, primarily because I just couldn't, for whatever reason, I couldn't. I wasn't feeling well and blah. So initially there was that arising of the mind saying I was responsible, because in the mirror of the reflection, it's part of the story of these patterns, that somehow my lack of action had enabled this situation to take place. And the ensuing effects of her death is my brother is also in need of great support in his life anyway, and she was taking care of him and the son. And so it also brought up this pattern that I inherited, that I am really responsible as an older sister for these people in my life, in my family, my brothers, both of whom have had a lot of difficulty. And therefore it was down to me to somehow be the savior of the family, which is probably what brought me into awakening, this deep kind of, there's something really wrong here, and to kind of save everybody. And actually in the awakening process, I stepped away from that role, which is like a death to the ego, which is still playing this, is questioning, sorry, this is a bit going on, but questioning that, you know, because it feels like I don't care, that I'm not caring for the world. And what I've been seeing today in sitting deeply and being in stillness is really connecting deeply with the no ego in me, no ego in the world. It's the one same, and actually feeling for the first time that it's great love. And how do I know that the death is it's not a bad thing? I can't even put that on it. It's just love moving in that way. And then so I feel that there's this massive choice that it's like I'm on this constant edge, that I can either really know that it's all just this play of a dream in which is there to wake me up. So I'm no longer playing the savior role of, now I've got to look after this disabled child that's been abandoned in the Philippines because his mother's just died or whatever, and my brother, and actually just be not have those projections onto the story, onto those people and onto myself, and step out of that entirely into love. And there is this supreme knowing of that, of loving, and it's deeply caring. It really cares, but has nothing to do with the dynamics of the situation. So it almost doesn't care that she's died. I know that sounds funny, but it doesn't really. It's more like it just loves that being that
she is, isn't it? It just is.
It just is. And yet there's this kind of so it's like this razor's edge of like the moment I contextualize, or I'm in relationship talking to other members of my family about this tragedy, then it's so easy to then be Sophie again, who needs to do X and Y or whatever, and kind of take on that role of comforting or not or whatever. So it's really, I mean, this is like a classic kind of, it's actually hell if I think that I'm responsible for her death. I mean, that is just pure hell. It's also hell if I believe that I've got to now rescue everybody else. So those are just utter suffering. I can't put myself through it. Yeah. But there is a seeing that, I'm still engaged in these people, with these people, and so that's the whole the whole grief. It's very sad. There's a lot, and also because it's just happened today, I'm feeling everybody, it's moving through everything. So inevitably there's all the emotion of everyone, well, no one, that's myself, the whole shockwave of it. So sorry. I'm giving it to God, I think.
If you can stay in that quiet place as much as possible, inside yourself as this is unfolding, then there'll be the unfolding of it will happen for the best of all beings involved on it, and it'll be that place where you can't blame yourself for that, but also can't take personal responsibility for it either. That it is that there's an opportunity here to go through this as the self, seeing what the self wants to do here, rather than perhaps play those old patterns out, as you were saying, that as a separate being I would have immediately felt I had to do this and this, and there's an opportunity here, even in the midst of the sadness and the grief and everything, and all the organization of this, everything that has to get organized, that the self can and will want to deal with this in a different way. And you don't have to know what that is right now, do you? You can completely not know how this is going to play out. It's like we've had only these two options. I have to engage in this as a separate being or completely pull back. And what happens if I engage in this but staying as the self as much as I can here. There'll be different turn of events that unfold, and a much smoother transition through this process for you. You know, it's the only way, isn't it? Because you said it's hell to touch it personally. And I think we all end up with a situation where we just cannot do it personally, you know, as a separate being anymore. It hurts too much. It kind of forces us to have to stay in what we've seen to be true as much as we can and to get through this. And it's totally okay in a situation like this to not have any clue what's going to happen next, isn't it? You know, to be the big sister, but to not know how this is going to move forward. You know, it's not completely on your shoulders to sort this out, you know, which is what perhaps our mind may say. You should know what to do right now, and you should have started something in motion or whatever it's saying to you, your mind. And you get a sense of it.
You cut out.
Did you get a sense that you feel?
You're back.
Oh, did you lose us? Sorry.
Just at the end, just last little bit. Yeah. No.
I was just saying, in case you missed it, that do you get a sense that you feel you should know what to do here or how to move forward?
Well, a lot of the organizational side is done by my mum. She's, you know, but in terms of it's coming to peace with it within the dream of, because I don't see any of these people as separate people. I see them as aspects of consciousness.
Yeah.
So it's coming to peace with that, and letting it be as it is in that, and yet, you know, I am haunted a bit by this lack of action that I didn't take, because that's such a pull back into that feeling of
Separateness. Yeah.
You know, that I didn't do something, like cause and effect. I didn't do something and it's led to this effect.
Mind saying this is the effect now. Yeah. So
yeah.
That will be a good place to investigate, wouldn't it? You know, is that really what happened? Did I choose to? Did my inaction? You know, is that something that could have been different or should have been different? Really, because that's what is being suggested to you by mind. You know, that if I had done something different before, this would be different that's happening now, and then that's really something to look into. I would suggest, you know, could I have done anything different than I did? It's a real good place to investigate. And could the outcome have been any different, you know, than it is? Because that's what the negative emotion is hanging on here, isn't it? This sense that I could have done something different in that moment. I could have made a different choice, and perhaps more clearly that I should have done something different, not just that I could. I should have taken some action, and I didn't, and therefore this is now occurring. But if there isn't this bunch of separate beings involved in this, is if, as you're saying, there is only the one being, then can your action or inaction affect another being, an other being? Or is that simply not true? Is the whole thing just playing out with each one of us thinking that we're doing our separate part to it, and then you know, mind grabs a hold of that and says, all this idea of cause and effect is based on this idea that you're separate to them, isn't it? That you made a choice in that moment, that you could have chosen something different as well in that moment, that you as a separate being chose not to do something for whatever reason. And it's simply not the case when we really look. Can our actions affect other beings if there aren't any other beings? I know this is a very radical way of thinking, but it's only what's true, you know?
Yeah.
It's only what's actually real. just because we've thought this way for a very long time doesn't mean it's ever been so. And now this situation is bringing this up for you, isn't it? This sense where you might perhaps tend to go back into separateness here and begin to take on the role of a separate being so that you can make a higher choice in this moment. You know, what happens when I let go of this idea of blaming myself for this, that I could have done something different. In reality, there's just the one being living, experiencing itself through all of these human bodies, isn't there?
Yeah.
And that is really what's going on all the time. Just because we think I'm here, you're over there, and I can take an action that's affecting you, you know, it's not actually how it's been ever.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think the confusion, where I get confused, is a sense of knowing that how you influence the world in a healing way, and that's where it kind of feeds into this causality thing. I know that just by being love is the transmission of that, but you feel that you need to take some, if there's action, and that's why it all gets kind of murky, like action, non-action.
Our actions and our thoughts, we get stuck every time. Only thing we can choose is what level of consciousness we're coming to a situation from. Am I coming from separateness, or am I coming from what's real here? As I stay in my own real, authentic nature, then my thoughts and actions will automatically come from that place anyway, and they'll be helpful and beneficial to everyone involved, including my own self. If I think I'm a separate being and I've got to try to figure out what to do and choose, it gets all very sticky very quickly, doesn't it? So the best thing we can do is stay in our authentic nature, and whatever thoughts and words and actions come out of that undivided place are going to be healing anyway. That they can't not be from that place. Then it begins to resolve on a higher way and an easier way, whatever the situation is. Then this whole idea of personal responsibility begins to melt away, and there's really only what's the highest option here in this moment, rather than what do I have to do, you know, and all these kind of decisions I feel I have to weigh one against the other, and you know, all that kind of slow, heavy energy that gets involved then.
Thank you. Thank you for this space and time. I'll listen to exactly what you said again. It cut off a bit, but I got everything. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to ask a question or to share anything before we finish? We will leave it there for this evening then. Thank you for joining me this evening in Satsang, and the next Satsang is Monday, 11 AM UK time. Thank you. Namaste.